The Batavia Mutiny, 1629. It turns out drowning in a shipwreck could be the best thing to happen to you, especially when you look at what happened in the Batavia Mutiny. In 1629, the Dutch East India Company sent the ship Batavia to Indonesia, but it never made it there because it smashed into a reef near Australia, turning what should have been a business trip into a survival thriller story. Around 40 people drowned right away, and they were the lucky ones. Meanwhile, the survivors made it to a tiny island with no food and water. The captain, Francisco Palsart, might as well have abandoned his men to death because he hopped on a longboat and sailed 2,000 miles to help. One of the officers, Euronymous Cornelis, decided he was now in charge. He was not just a bad leader, but a full-blown villain with psychotic tendencies. Cornelis and his gang of mutineers started killing people because food was running low, and they began eating their friends. A group of soldiers escaped to another island. Despite repeated attacks from the mutineers, they held out until Palsart finally returned with a rescue ship, probably expecting to find tired survivors. Instead, he found a floating crime scene. Palsart wasted no time in arresting Cornelis and his gang of wannabe pirate overlords. The punishments were brutal. Cornelis had his hands chopped off before he was hanged. Meanwhile, the other mutineers got dumped in Australia to die from starvation or by becoming lunch to one of the horrifying creatures there. USS Jeannette, 1879. The North Pole is one of the coldest places in the world, making it the worst travel destination for anyone during the 1800s. But the crew of the USS Jeannette didn't care. Instead of a nice trip to a tropical island like Hawaii, they took their ship to the freezing north to make history and become the first to sail there. But the Arctic had a different idea. As soon as the ship reached the ice, it got stuck. Not a little stuck, but completely stuck. The crew drifted for nearly 2 years, waiting for nature to let them go. Nature did let them go, but not in the way they wanted. In June 1881, the ice crushed the ship like an empty can. The crew had no choice but to grab their supplies and start walking. They weren't walking to the next town, but were dragging heavy lifeboats across miles of frozen wasteland. Some fell through the ice, while others lost fingers to frostbite. One guy amputated his own finger as well. This was not the fun adventure they expected when they set sail 2 years ago. Eventually, they reached open water and split into 3 boats, only for one boat to sink almost immediately. While the other 2 boats made it to Siberia, the nightmarish trip wasn't over. One boat ran out of food and discovered that hunger plus freezing temperatures equals a very bad time. The other was a bit lucky because they found a good spot to start a small village. They tried to go back and save their comrades, only for them to find frozen bodies and a journal that told the whole miserable story. Out of 33 men, only 13 survived. Meanwhile, the survivors realized that bravery can't do shit when facing the Arctic's freezing temperatures. The Narvaez Expedition, 1527 to 1536. If you go out on an expedition with 600 men, but come back with only 4 survivors, you're probably history's worst explorer. A 99.33% death rate isn't something you'd want on your resume. That's how bad the Narvaez expedition was. Panfilo de Narvaez got permission from Spain to claim Florida, thinking it would be easy. But while the trip to Florida wasn't too bad, Narvaez quickly discovered that Florida was full of swamps, mosquitoes, and angry locals who weren't interested in befriending these strange white men. That was when Narvaez made the first of many terrible decisions. He split his forces, telling the ships to go one way while he and the men marched inland. But both groups surely needed GPS in the 1500s because they both got lost. Narvaez and the man on land found no gold, food, or friendly faces. Instead, they found hunger, disease, and tribes who did not appreciate uninvited trespassers. By the time they stumbled back to the coast, they realized their ships had abandoned them and went back to Spain. With no other options, they built makeshift rafts out of desperation and driftwood. They tried to sail to Mexico, but a storm sent them straight to disaster, killing Narvaez and most of his men. Those who made it ashore in present-day Texas were in for a bad time when starvation turned them into human skeletons. Some of them were captured, while the others were eaten by wild animals and cannibals. The lucky ones had to deal with extreme suffering. After 8 years of misery, the 4 survivors reached Spanish territory in 1536. They were half-naked, buried under layers of beard, and looked less like explorers and more like wild men who had lost a fight with nature. One of the survivors later wrote a book about their nightmare, describing lands, plants, and people the Spanish had never seen. But another survivor didn't learn his lesson when he guided another expedition years later and was immediately killed. 2008 K2 disaster. Just because K2 is the silver medalist of the tallest mountain in the world contest, it doesn't mean it's not as dangerous as Everest. It's actually a lot more dangerous than the world's highest peak, making it the unfriendliest place for even the most experienced mountain climbers. Its slopes are steep, and the ice is unstable. If something goes wrong, you do not get a second chance. But in 2008, 11 climbers didn't get the memo of how dangerous this mountain is. On August 1st, a group of climbers from different teams decided to go to the summit. They left late, which was like starting a road trip at midnight with no gas. The worst part of the climb was the bottleneck. This was a narrow path under a massive ice wall, basically a frozen hammer waiting to smash anything below. That day, the hammer dropped. A giant chunk of ice fell, knocking out the ropes climbers needed to get down. The whole thing was made worse by delays, bad decisions, and terrible luck. On the way to the top, some climbers took too long, probably taking a few pictures for a scrapbook they never had a chance to make. The others, meanwhile, ignored obvious signs of danger, and when the ice finally collapsed, it was like someone flipped a switch from difficult climb to certain death trip. Now the real disaster started. Some climbers were stranded at the top, realizing they had booked a one-way trip with no return ticket. Others were so exhausted they couldn't move. One group used a rope to descend, but gravity had other plans. Meanwhile, avalanches decided to join the fun, sweeping climbers away like a janitor clearing a messy floor. Rescuers tried to help, but they couldn't do anything to save the 11 climbers who were added to K2's collection of frozen corpses. Columbia disaster, 2003. Space exploration is like a double-edged sword because you have to survive the actual trip to space and the return home, which might be more dangerous if things don't go your way. That's what happened in the Columbia disaster of 2003. The space shuttle Columbia succeeded in its trip to space to conduct fancy space experiments. Just as the crew thought their job was done and could now go home, the ship decided to take them down to Earth in the worst way possible. And it all started before the actual launch. Upon leaving the planet, a piece of foam insulation fell off the tank and hit the left wing. Normally, foam, that stuff that keeps your drinks cold, sounds harmless. But in space, it's like a wrecking ball. It punched a hole in the wing's heat shield. NASA, unfortunately, didn't have enough cameras in space to notice the damage, and the crew also didn't realize they were operating on one good wing because they were too busy staying alive inside the ship. The damage on the wing was like ignoring a crack in your car's brakes, except instead of a fender bender, you get a spaceship disassembly at 12,000 miles per hour. So when Columbia re-entered Earth's atmosphere, the brakes refused to work. Hot gases over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit rushed into the hole, melting the wing from the inside. With one wing turning into a science experiment in thermodynamics, the shuttle lost control and tragically broke apart over Texas and Louisiana. All 7 astronauts died. NASA later admitted they already knew something was wrong, but the people in charge brushed it off. It was like hearing a smoke alarm and deciding it was probably nothing. Kon-Tiki, 1947. It's 1947, and you're Thor Heyerdahl, who theorized that ancient South Americans could have floated to Polynesia on simple rafts. Everyone thought you were spouting nonsense instead of spitting facts. So, to silence your doubters, you try to prove your theory by going on the same trip you believe the Polynesians took. That's basically how Thor's "I told you so" story turned into a disaster. Armed with the bravery and confidence of the god of thunder, Thor made a simple raft using only old-school materials like balsa wood, rope, and the hopes and dreams of proving his point. He named it Kon-Tiki and convinced 5 other guys to wave goodbye, to leave Peru, and let the ocean take them where it wanted. It turned out the seas took them to a watery grave. The Pacific Ocean did not care about Heyerdahl's experiment when the waves tossed the raft like a toy. Sharks, hoping for a free snack, weren't too far behind. With the crew hoping they wouldn't turn into fish food, they survived by eating fish and drinking rainwater. But there was only so much they could do when the sun was cooking them all day, and while the sea tried rocking them to death at night, they drifted for 101 days on a floating pile of sticks, all while thinking this was the worst idea in the history of bad ideas. Just when land finally appeared, Kon-Tiki decided it had had enough. It smashed into a coral reef near Roroya in the Tuamotu Islands. The impact was strong enough to nearly destroy the raft and force the crew to abandon the ship and swim to a nearby island. Thankfully for them, the locals were not the cannibalistic kind. They helped the crew get back to civilization. Thor, meanwhile, got fame and bragging rights back home, but could have been swimming with the fish if Lady Luck wasn't on his side. If you think you're also lucky to be alive, James Cook's Third Voyage, 1779. If you're one of the greatest explorers in history, you probably also need to control your temper, even in a tough situation. James Cook, a legendary explorer in his own right, made a big mistake that eventually turned into the gold medal winning decision for the worst things to do during an exploration. Cook was sailing around the Pacific looking for a shortcut through the Arctic. While there was no shortcut, he didn't know that yet. In 1778, he reached Hawaii, where the locals took one look at this pale, uniformed stranger and figured he had to be some kind of god. Naturally, Cook didn't correct them because he enjoyed the freebies that came with his fake god status. But duty called. As tempting as it was to retire early in paradise, he had a mission to complete. That's when things went south, literally and figuratively. Bad weather, ship troubles, and general misfortune forced him to turn back. But this time, the Hawaiians took one look at him and realized the truth. This wasn't a god. This was just some guy who wouldn't take a hint. Cook and his sailors grabbed whatever supplies they could from the Hawaiians, basically treating the island like a grocery store with no checkout line. Naturally, this didn't sit well with the locals. Then one of Cook's boats disappeared, and he immediately started blaming the Hawaiians, going as far as kidnapping their chief. This was a fatal mistake. The Hawaiians fought back, not keen on letting their leader become a British souvenir. Normally, you'd bet on guys using guns over the spear-wielding natives, but it was basically a 10-to-1 advantage in favor of the Hawaiians, as they outnumbered Cook and his men. The legendary explorer was killed. While the Hawaiians took his body, they returned some of his remains. The worst take-home package his men could ever get from this failed exploration. Titan Submersible 2023. If you mix a group of bored millionaires with a submarine made from lightweight material and controlled by a cheap controller, you get a recipe for disaster. The Titan Submersible disaster is Exhibit A. In 2023, 5 rich people who funded a visit to the Titanic wreckage boarded the Titan because watching the Oscar-winning movie wasn't immersive enough. This submersible, however, was not built like military submarines. Instead of using strong steel or titanium, it was mostly carbon fiber. This material is good for bikes and airplanes because it's lightweight and durable enough, but for deep sea pressure, it's as durable as paper. OceanGate, the company that built the Titan, ignored the warnings, claiming it was innovative enough to be safe. What made it worse was that it wasn't even using groundbreaking technology. The thing had worse controls than a 90s video game, no reliable way to call for help, and an interior that made budget airline seats look like luxury. So when the passengers boarded the exploration sub, that was the last time anyone saw them, because they never reported back or resurfaced. 4 days later, search teams found pieces of the sub on the ocean floor, realizing it had imploded because the water was too much for its weak structure. The implosion happened so fast that the people inside probably never knew what hit them. 1 second, they were diving, the next, they were gone, just like that, especially when their suits weren't built to handle underwater pressure. No one survived. OceanGate promised an adventure of a lifetime, and technically they delivered, but not the way anyone expected. This was less of an accident and more of people letting safety take the back seat to risky ideas. Tutankhamun's Curse, 1920s. If you see an ancient Egyptian tomb that's been sealed for thousands of years, it might be best to leave it alone because you don't even know what's in there. But the exploration team that dug up King Tutankhamun's tomb was too excited to know when to stop. British archaeologist Howard Carter found King Tut's tomb in 1922, and the world lost its mind. Egyptian archaeology was the hottest trend. It was like the TikTok of the 1920s, but with more mummies and fewer dance challenges. Everyone wanted a piece of the gold, statues, and treasures chilling there for over 3,000 years. But then things got weird. People started dropping like cursed flies because King Tut wasn't too happy with people messing with his afterlife crib. Lord Carnarvon, the rich guy who paid for the dig, got a mosquito bite, shaved over it, and got an infection. He died a few months later. It sounds ridiculous, but that was enough for people to scream curse. The newspapers had a field day. They claimed anyone who entered the tomb would drop dead. People who had never even heard of Tutankhamun suddenly decided they were experts in ancient Egyptian revenge. A few more members of the excavation team died in the next few years, giving fuel to the curse fire people love talking about. The Curse of the Pharaohs became famous. People loved the idea of an angry mummy keeping a hit list. It was spooky and exciting, but also complete nonsense, because most people who were there when the tomb was opened survived for decades more. Scientists later suggested that mold or bacteria trapped in the sealed tomb could have caused some deaths, but that's way less exciting than an invisible pharaoh getting revenge from beyond the grave. The Niger Expedition, 1841. The Niger Expedition wasn't about where the N-word comes from. Instead, it was a trip to the Niger River in the name of trade, science, and stopping the slave trade. But the guys who needed help were not the slaves, but the people behind the expedition. The British packed 3 ships with over 150 people. There were scientists, doctors, and missionaries. They wanted to set up a colony and teach local leaders better ways to make money so that no one had to sell slaves anymore. But they forgot that mosquitoes were better at teaching people how to get malaria. Within weeks, malaria and yellow fever spread like gossip. People collapsed left and right. The jungle was hot, the air was thick, and the mosquitoes were having the best buffet of their lives on unprepared explorers who'd never experienced getting their blood sucked before. Over 40 people died. Many more got so sick they had to be sent home. HMS Sudan gave up first. Soon after, HMS Wilberforce followed. HMS Albert tried to keep going, but looked around and decided to stop making bad choices when their captain got sick and allowed someone else to take over. But they weren't as unprepared as you'd think. The British had quinine, a malaria medicine. Their problem was they did not use it properly. They might as well have sprinkled it on their food and hoped for the best. They got to their destination and signed treaties, but lost many lives in the process. They also failed to set up a colony because there were far too few people left to handle it. And as soon as they got home, they earned the nickname the Death Expedition after discovering mosquitoes don't care about good intentions. The Essex Whale Attack, 1820. It's the 1800s, and whale oil was like liquid gold because people used it for lamps and a lot of other stuff that kept civilization running. That was why whales were basically swimming fuel tanks. So a whaling ship called Essex left to hunt whales. But a particularly angry sperm whale flipped the script. This whale was huge, probably 85 feet long, and not in the mood to be hunted. It swam straight at the ship with the anger of its hunted ancestors. The whale slammed into the hull twice. Its second strike cracked the ship like an egg. Water rushed in, and Essex started sinking. The whale swam away, probably feeling pretty proud of itself. Now the crew had a new problem. Their big sturdy ship was gone. All they had were tiny lifeboats, barely any food, and a lot of bad luck. They were stuck thousands of miles from land. While there was an island nearby, they avoided it because they were afraid of cannibals. Later, that decision would seem pretty ironic. Weeks passed, and the men saw no signs of rescue. One by one, sailors started dying from starvation and exhaustion. The survivors did the only thing they could by eating the dead. At that point, a floating island full of cannibals might have seemed like a five-star restaurant. After months of misery, a passing ship finally found the last few survivors. They looked like they had just lost a fight with the ocean. Out of the original 20 crew members, only 8 made it home. Owen Chase, the first mate, wrote about the disaster. His story later helped inspire Moby Dick, a book about another stubborn whale that refused to go down without a fight. Maurice Wilson's Everest disaster, 1934. Maurice Wilson took the term solo flight way too seriously when he attempted to climb Everest alone. This was the 1930s, when no one had ever conquered this mountain, even with group effort. But Wilson thought he could do better than every experienced climbing group. The problem was not only his sheer overconfidence, but also his lack of experience. Before that, he had never climbed anything taller than a staircase. Wilson also had no proper gear or sense of self-preservation. He simply thought that prayer, fasting, and determination would get him to the top. But he might as well have written a suicide note before he left. His plan was worse. He originally wanted to fly a plane from England to Everest and crash-landed on the mountain before making the climb. But when the British authorities in India saw how stupid his plan was, they grounded him. This was probably God's way of telling him he needed to back down. But Wilson's stubbornness led him to walk the rest of the way to Everest. To avoid being caught, he disguised himself as a Buddhist monk and sneaked into Tibet. A 6-foot-tall British man pretending to be a local monk was not the best disguise, but he managed to reach Everest with 3 Sherpa guides. The Sherpas, who actually knew how to survive, quickly realized Wilson had no clue what he was doing. Wilson made several attempts to climb. He kept getting lost, stuck in deep snow, and nearly freezing to death. The Sherpas kept dragging him back to camp like an overconfident tourist who ignored the safety instructions. Eventually, they refused to help him anymore. Wilson, being stubborn as usual, decided to climb alone. That was his final mistake. A year later, a British expedition found his frozen body in a tent at 6,920 meters.